because all that was not enough for one summer Friday evening, the Washington Post reports tonight that President Trump has directed Immigration and Customs Enforcement to, quote, conduct a mass roundup of migrant families with pre-dawn raids in major U.S. cities on Sunday. Now, there's been some confusion about these raids. Trump first said the raids would round up millions. Then officials said there was no such plan. Then it was reported that a much smaller plan had sort of been in the works for a while, maybe, and now we have word that Donald Trump has ordered that operation. The trouble with covering news like this is certainly an operation to round up 2,000 undocumented immigrants, specifically targeted at families. Well, that's a big, serious, consequential thing for a lot of people. That is a scary thing. But if there's one thing Donald Trump is invested in more than any other, it is that he is personally ordering big, serious, consequential, scary things aimed at immigrants. I mean, we don't know if this operation is actually going to happen on Sunday, but we definitely know the president wants people to think it is. As the Washington Post put it today, quote, some within DHS and ICE say the president appears to be using the operation for political purposes as he begins his re-election bid. Law enforcement officials worry that by publicly discussing the plan, Trump has undermined the chances of capturing those on the target list, as it likely pushed migrants with deportation orders underground. Now, if Trump is undercutting the success of his own operation by announcing it in advance, it's probably safe to say that announcing the operation is more important to him than actually carrying it out. And that's kind of a pattern with this president. Earlier this year, President Trump announced on Twitter that he was cutting off federal emergency aid to California because he was convinced the state was doing something wrong with its forest management or something. But it turned out he never actually ordered FEMA to do anything of the sort. Last fall, Trump boasted constantly about a new tax cut that he and Republicans in Congress had come up with. They were putting the finishing touches on it. It would be unveiled right before the election. No one in Congress had any idea what the president was talking about, and even White House officials quietly admitted they were mystified. When asked about the tax cut, Trump's own Treasury Secretary said this, I quote, I'm not going to comment on whether it is a real thing or not a real thing. Trump talked about it at his rallies. It was a major applause line. But as you may have noticed, there was no new tax cut plan. There never had been. The president likes to say that his border wall is being built or has been built or is nearly finished or is finished. One time they even put up a plaque on some replacement fencing that had been ordered by the Obama administration, and they just called it Trump's wall. It's created this strange, uncomfortable dynamic in which everyone, the press, foreign governments, members of Congress, they all have to constantly be gauging what relation, if any, Trump's pronouncements have to reality. Last year, after Trump announced he was calling off negotiations over the Dreamers, undocumented immigrants brought here as children, the New York Times noted in passing, quote, it was unclear whether the president's tweets represented any change in his immigration policy or were just the sort of venting he's known to do after reading a newspaper article or seeing a television program. The same year, when Trump announced he was delaying a trade agreement with South Korea, the Washington Post's David Ignatius said one South Korean asked him, quote, were the president's comments about holding the new trade deal, was that real? Did he really mean that, or was he just ad-libbing? The president is, in effect, an unreliable narrator of his own presidency, and everyone knows that, which is a big, big part of what makes the current situation we are in, this fraught situation with Iran, so dangerous.
So did you greenlight something, or had you said, if we do it, I'll do this? What was the order you gave?
Nothing is greenlighted until the very end because things change, right?
So you never gave a final order?
No. But we had something ready to go subject to my approval. And they came in, and they came in about a half an hour before. They said, sir, we're about ready to go. I said, I want a better
planes
definition.
In the air? Were planes in the air?
We're about ready to go.
Yeah?
No, but they would have been pretty soon. And things would have happened to a point where you wouldn't turn back or couldn't turn back. So they came and they said, sir, we're ready to go. We'd like a decision. I said, I want to know something before you go. How many people will be killed? In this case, Iranians. Mm-hmm. I said, how many people are going to be killed? Sir, I'd like to get back to you on that. Great people, these generals. They said, came back, said, sir, approximately 150. And I thought about it for a second. I said, you know what? They shot down an unmanned drone, plane, whatever you want to call it. And here we are sitting with 150 dead people. That would have taken place probably within a half an hour after I said go ahead. Yeah. And I didn't like it. I didn't think it was proportionate.
Okay, obviously we don't know what happened last night in the White House when a missile strike on Iran was ostensibly ordered and then canceled. We weren't in the room. But it is nearly impossible to believe that it went down as the president described it to Chuck Todd today. The president is saying that half an hour before the planes were to take off to launch a carefully planned missile strike, he asked his generals how many casualties there would be. And the generals who had planned this operation and presented it to the president and prepped it to go and were ready to launch said to the president, you know what, that's a good question. We hadn't thought about that. We're not sure. Let us get back to you. If that is what happened, that level of carelessness and slapdash planning would be a scandal unto itself. Ryan Goodman, a former Defense Department lawyer, suggested today that it would likely be illegal to approve an operation without knowing the estimated casualties that it would cause. And then there is the multiple source reporting from various outlets contradicting the president's version of events. The New York Times reporting that, in fact, planes were already in the air when the president canceled the operation. The Washington Post reporting this evening that, in fact, the president was informed of the number of estimated casualties earlier in the day when he approved the strike. The president being an unreliable narrator makes it difficult, if not impossible, for us as citizens to understand exactly what is happening here. Was there actually a strike ordered and then called off at the last minute? Why did that happen? Who in the administration decided it would be a good thing for us all to know that that is what happened, because it was leaked to the press almost immediately? Much of the information we're getting may in fact be various factions within the administration trying to box the president into a particular course of action, because as we know, the president's main source of information is this: cable television. The Times reports that, quote, Mr. Trump's national security advisors split about whether to respond militarily to the downing of an American drone. Quote, senior administration officials said Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, the national security advisor, and Gina Haspel, the CIA director, had favored a military response. But top Pentagon officials cautioned that such an action could result in a spiraling escalation with risks for American forces in the region. If it is top Pentagon officials who are the primary voice against escalation with Iran, then this is probably a particularly bad time for one acting defense chief to be handing off to another acting defense chief. Tonight, the president did announce his intention to nominate that new acting chief to be the actual defense secretary, which means he will be going through the Senate confirmation process as this confrontation with Iran unspools. Now, ever since this administration withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal and began ratcheting up pressure on Iran, it's been unclear what its goal is or what its end game is. And now we've reached this point where, to hear the president tell it last night, we may have been minutes away from a strike that could potentially have led to a war. And we have little to no clarity about what happened or why or what happens next. Joining us now, Courtney Kube, NBC National News security and military reporter who just returned from the United Arab Emirates, where the United States has deployed additional assets in response to escalating tensions. Courtney, thank you for joining us tonight. Courtney, you know the Pentagon well. Yesterday night, we got reporting that planes were in the air and ships were in position, and the president called off the strike. Today, the president told Chuck Todd that the planes were not in the air. What are you hearing?
So the ships would obviously have already been in position. You know, so U.S. Central Command has anywhere between 60 and 80,000 troops, ships, aircraft throughout the region at any given time. The aircraft, the officials who I've spoken with say that, in fact, the aircraft were not in the air at the time yet, but that they were close. So, you know, you made a good point in the intro, and that's that the idea that the military, when they were planning this operation, when they were looking at the various options, they look at all the contingencies. And one of those is what they call a collateral damage assessment. That is the potential for how many civilians could be hurt or killed in this kind of an operation. What we don't know is exactly what happened in that meeting at the White House yesterday. Did they sit the president down when they walked him through the options and explain to him the collateral damage assessment or not? But the notion that it wouldn't be part of the original military planning is pretty difficult to understand, Ali.
And following on that, is it possible that the president would only have learned that approximately 150 people would die with minutes to spare? I would imagine when there's a submission of that sort of proposal, General Barry McCaffrey told me last night that they've got proposals for any contingency about places you don't even think we have aggressive relationships with. But that the idea of what we call collateral damage, the death of people, that would have to be very high up in that report.
It would be. I mean, but again, what we don't know is exactly what happened when they presented it to him. If that's something that he didn't ask the question, or for some reason they didn't present it as part of basic and very standard military planning for an operation like this, especially something so high profile. I find it impossible to believe that that wasn't part of the original planning. But again, we just don't know how the conversation was. I mean, when you look at the basic idea here, I was also struck when the president said that 150 people, whether that is civilians or Iranian military, would potentially have been killed in these kinds of strikes. I mean, that is not the military officials I was speaking to said that this would be any kind of a reaction would be very proportional, that it would be, to what actually happened here. So the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps shot down a U.S. drone, unmanned, of course, drone, an expensive drone, no loss of life. You would think that the U.S. military response would be something that would take out perhaps the place where they shot the surface-to-air missile from, perhaps the radar system that was used to lock in on the drone, something like that. The notion that it would involve that many casualties was really surprising to me, Ali.
Now, there's been a dispute in the last few days about where this drone was shot. The distance between what America claims and Iran claims isn't that big, but what Iran claims is that it was in Iranian airspace, and what America claims is that it was in international airspace. We're now hearing some reporting that it was in Iranian airspace. What are you hearing about that?
So the U.S. military still denies that they had any assets. There was also a U.S. Navy surveillance plane, a P-8, that was up around the same time that was near it. But the military maintains that both of them stayed in international airspace. One of the problems here could be the fact that Iran sees a lot of the area in the Strait of Hormuz as their territorial waters and their territorial airspace. So it may just be that they still believed, despite the fact that the international community sees it as international waters and airspace, they may have believed that it drifted into their territorial waters. I was out on the Gulf of Oman only a couple of miles from where that drone was shot down, and I can tell you that that area is considered international waters if, in fact, the drone went down where the U.S. military tells us it did.
Courtney, thank you for your reporting on this. Courtney Kube, NBC News national security and military reporter.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.